So this is just a proposal that I would think makes no sense for Hamas to accept.
Hello and welcome back to the Spectator Show. I'm delighted to be joined today by one of our favourite guests, Professor John Mearsheimer, and we're going to be talking about Trump's peace plan for Gaza, which Donald Trump unveiled yesterday with Benjamin Netanyahu. I think it's fair to say that Donald Trump seemed a little bit flatter than usual while delivering it. He said it was the most, I think he said, could be the most historic day for the whole of civilization, I think was what he said. But did you get the impression that he wasn't quite believing what he was saying, John?
I did. I think, first of all, he's just worn out from being president and dealing with all these foreign policy crises and actually not having much success. I mean, if you think about it, the two big issues confronting him are, number one, the Gaza genocide, and number two, the Ukraine war. And I do believe that he fervently wants to end both of them. And he's been unable to shut down the Ukraine war. It's a constant source of trouble for him. And the same thing is true here. I mean, he's been getting pounded from two sides on this issue. On one side, from Israel and its supporters in the United States, to include Prime Minister Netanyahu, who is a very skillful politician, especially when it comes to, exercising influence inside the United States. But also on the other side, there are all sorts of people inside the Republican Party now and inside the United States who want to change America's relationship with Israel and put an end to the genocide. And then, of course, he's getting all sorts of pressure from outside of the United States to just put an end to this. And it's not easy to do in the case of Gaza any more than it's easy to do in the case of Ukraine. And I think when you combine those factors with the fact that he is a 79-year-old man, that, he's looking like he's worn down. I've seen him on a number of occasions lacking that bounce in his step that he had before he moved back into the White House in January. And I think it's understandable.
Well, he does. I would agree with that certainly yesterday. And I mean, he does. I think we should acknowledge that he does have an extraordinary amount of energy for a man of his age. But I think on the Gaza and Ukraine, I think while I know you have lots of criticisms of Trump's foreign policy, I think you would also acknowledge that the direction he wants to go in is towards peace. And he's more clear on that than the Biden administration was.
I think there's no question about it. I think Trump is not a warmonger. His first instinct is not to reach for the gun. And I think for the Democrats in general and for President Biden in particular, he was not hesitant about using military force. I still remain amazed at the extent to which the Biden administration welcomed a war with Russia over Ukraine. We did virtually nothing to prevent that war. And then when the negotiations started in Istanbul and looked like they were making real progress, it was the Americans, along with the British, who pushed the Ukrainians, the Zelensky government, to walk away from those negotiations. So I think that President Biden was a warmonger in ways that Trump is not. But the fact is, Trump has not been successful at shutting down these wars, and he's actually ended up starting a few shooting conflicts of his own, one being the June 22nd attack on Iran, and the other his month-long war against Yemen. So he's been frustrated in terms of achieving his goals.
Mm. And he is today threatening more military action against in Venezuela. So that's another area of conflict which he's seems to be pursuing. But let's talk a little bit about this Gaza proposal. It's a 20-point plan. There's a board of peace, which includes, to much amusement in British circles, Tony Blair is on the board of peace. What do you make of it all? What does it feel like to you?
I think the proposal is basically an Israeli-American proposal. Prime Minister Netanyahu came over here early, and he had hours-long meetings last Thursday and this past Sunday with Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, who are obviously very close advisors to President Trump and who are both ardent Zionists. And the final deal that was worked out, the final plan that was released yesterday, the 20-point plan, was changed from previous plans in ways that worked to the Israelis' advantage. As an article in the Times of Israel says today, Israel got everything that it wanted in the deal. So it's really not an American proposal. It's an Israeli-American proposal. And of course, Hamas was not consulted at all in the process. They were simply presented with a fait accompli. And unsurprisingly, I think when you look at the deal, it's a deal that Hamas would be foolish to accept. They lose on all the key issues. And let me just walk you through a couple of them. First of all, they have to give up all the hostages in the first 72 hours. And everybody recognizes that the hostages are their leverage. So they give up their leverage. With regard to what happens to Hamas, the agreement is that Hamas will be completely disarmed to include all the tunnels being destroyed. That would mean that Hamas and the Gazans would be left defenseless. Third, the Israelis are not required to leave all of Gaza. And one of the principal demands of Hamas has been that the Israelis completely pull out of Gaza. They would pull out in a phased withdrawal. And even in the end, they would be left inside of Gaza along the perimeter of that piece of real estate. So this is an ideal situation for the Israelis, and it's disastrous for the Palestinians. But then we get to the most important problem. First of all, there's no sense of self-determination in the agreement. We basically have said how Gaza will be governed in the future. It won't be governed for a long time by the Palestinians. And then when the Palestinians do take over, we have decided who will take over, the Palestinian Authority, that is, who we will educate in the meantime to be responsible governors of Gaza. And then finally, and maybe most importantly, what's the end game here? Are the Palestinians going to get a state of their own? No. What is, as is mentioned in the final point, the 20th point of the document, what is the political horizon here that Palestinians can look toward? And the answer is they don't know what the political horizon is, what the final outcome is here. And the 20th point says that the United States is going to help set up a dialogue between all the parties so they can figure out what the end game is. So this is just a proposal that I would think makes no sense for Hamas to accept.
Well, Netanyahu said we can do this the easy way or the hard way. And so from what you're saying, it sounds like you think that everybody knows that the easy way is a non sequitur. And so it is going to be the hard way. And what is the hard way?
Well, the hard way is to continue the offensive that's now taking place in Gaza City and to drive all the Palestinians into the southernmost part of Gaza and then hopefully expel them into Egypt. I mean, I think this is what the Israelis want to do. They're very, very clear on it in the Hebrew press, and a number of times people say this publicly in English, but that is the ultimate goal. And in effect, this is, continuing the genocide. And the question you have to ask yourself is whether you think the Israelis can achieve this outcome or not. there's all this talk about defeating Hamas, and there's this idea that Hamas has been defeated. I actually don't believe that. I followed the war conflict in Gaza very carefully, and there are very few reports, Freddie, of major engagements between Hamas fighters and Israeli fighters. It's not like they're having big battles where the Israelis or the IDF is destroying Hamas. In fact, Hamas is hiding in the tunnels and hiding in other places, as you would expect. They're not going to get out in the open. So I don't believe that they have killed that many fighters on the Hamas side. And furthermore, there's a huge number of young males who they can easily recruit as they grow older into Hamas. So I think Hamas is alive and capable of continuing the fight. And the Israelis, for their part, are suffering enormously from this war. It's doing amazing damage to their reputation, to their position, even in the United States. And if you look at what's happening inside Israel, it's quite clear that the IDF is in real trouble. It's no accident that the chief of staff of the IDF, a man who was handpicked by Netanyahu, was adamantly opposed, and I mean adamantly opposed to the offensive in Gaza City, because he understands how much trouble the IDF is in. So I think if they do it the hard way, which is likely, I don't think they're going to succeed. I think the Israelis would be in a much better position if Hamas accepted this deal. But I think Hamas will figure that out itself and therefore won't accept the deal.
You mentioned about how hard it is to get a sense of how many fighters they've killed, but you do also use this word genocide, which is controversial as a term. I think isn't one of the problems, though, that there's a very grave lack of transparency about what is actually going on the ground, and we can't really trust the sources that we have for reliable information on the ground. I mean, where do you turn to for your information on fatalities and so on?
Well, Freddie, I think we have very good information on what exactly is happening inside of Gaza. Despite the Israelis' efforts to sort of keep the mainstream media out, I think there's sufficient information to know what's going on. The question is whether you consider it a genocide or not. And that's a term that some people do not like to use. But I would note to you that virtually every major human rights organization in the world, including Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and B'Tselem, which is an Israeli organization, human rights organization, a United Nations independent commission that was set up to study this issue, numerous people who are experts on genocide, and so forth and so on, have labeled this a genocide. What are we saying here? That these people are anti-Semites? That they're trying to smear Israel? That there's a giant conspiracy here among all these human rights groups and these international institutions? I don't think so. These are people who study these issues for a profession. This is their job. And they've looked very carefully at this case, and virtually all of them have decided that this is a genocide.
I suppose my objection to the term genocide is it's a very politicized term, and it almost is used to actually lessen lesser evils. I'm talking in other cases, that unless something is registered as a genocide by international bodies, people don't seem to make much of a fuss about it. And I find the term has become too politicized. That's my objection to it. Would you agree with that somewhat?
Yes, I would agree with that. I think the term is used much too loosely. It's when I was younger, and if you didn't agree with somebody, you called them a fascist. Many people thought because I was reasonably conservative in the context of the times that I was a fascist. This is ludicrous. And, just killing large numbers of people in a war is not a genocide. I mean, what the United States did against Japan in World War II, and there I estimate that we killed, I would use the word murdered, 900,000 Japanese civilians. And we did it knowingly. Right? We were targeting Japanese civilians. 900,000 died. This includes people killed in Hiroshima and Nagasaki when we dropped the atomic bombs. But I would not call that a genocide because we were not trying to eliminate a people. I mean, what the Germans did to the Jews in World War II is obviously a genocide. There's no question there. But the point I'm making is that that is different than what the United States did when it bombed Japan. And I think if you look carefully, as all these human rights organizations and these international institutions have done, at what the Israelis are doing in Gaza, it qualifies as a genocide. But I would say to people who don't like to use that term, if you don't want to call it a genocide, what do you want to call it? Mass murder? But I think there's no question that what the Israelis are doing is clearly beyond the pale. It's clearly unacceptable. And as I said before, it has done enormous damage to Israel's reputation, and it will be a stain on Israel's reputation for as far as the eye can see.
Well, Israel is very adamant that until the hostages are returned, it's not going to change its position. What do you think the chances of that are?
Well, I think that there's no question that Hamas is not going to release those last prisoners or all of them until it gets a deal that it finds satisfactory. Exactly what that deal looks like is hard to say because the Palestinians have been so thoroughly decimated by this conflict that Hamas may be willing to accept terms today that it wasn't willing to accept a year ago. But they're not going to release the hostages until they get a deal that they find acceptable. And I think that's where we are. And again, going back to the 20-point plan that President Trump put forward, he's saying that the first thing that has to happen is that that Hamas has to release all the hostages within 72 hours. And this, I think, from Hamas's point of view, would be crazy, in large part because those hostages are leverage. They're only leverage.
Mm. You mentioned Jared Kushner, and of course, Jared Kushner in the first administration was very involved in the Abraham Accords, which are a great point of pride for Trump and the Trump circle. The sort of cherry on top of the Abraham Accords is always going to be some sort of accord between Saudi Arabia and Israel, brokered by Trump. And it's widely said, I don't know if you agree with this, that the situation in Gaza makes that impossible. But it's evident in the plan that was unveiled yesterday that there is an attempt to involve the Arab states, and this might, if they can come to some sort of agreement, this might lead to a Saudi-Israeli accord. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think what you say is correct. I think that Trump has long made it clear that what he'd like to do is create a Abraham Accord involving Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the United States. I mean, one of the problems that we face, Freddie, is that Saudi Arabia is drifting away from us. Saudi Arabia has just formed a military alliance with Pakistan. And if you read the Saudi press carefully, it's quite clear that they no longer trust the United States and they're looking for other partners to help provide security for them. And this has all sorts of consequences when you think about China down the road interfering more and more in the Middle East. So what Trump would like to do is bring the Saudis, the Israelis, and the Americans all together and do this through an Abraham Accord. But of course, the Gaza genocide has made this impossible, as I think almost everybody understands. And Trump's feeling is that if he can settle the Gaza conflict and put an end to what's going on in Gaza and create a peaceful situation in Gaza, then he can get an Abraham Accord with Saudi Arabia. Somebody was actually telling me that he was mentioning the possibility, Trump was, of an Abraham Accord with Iran, which of course sounds outrageous. But again, this gets back to where we started. I think that Trump's instinct is to try and create peace, not to have war, and for everybody to get along and then do business. He's basically a businessman, right? Let's do deals. He'd like to do deals with Iran. He'd like to do deals with Saudi Arabia. He'd like to do deals with Putin. He's a tough guy, and he likes to, occasionally slap people around. And in fact, it looks like he enjoys slapping allies around more than adversaries. But nevertheless, he's not a warmonger. And I think he would genuinely like to have an Abraham Accord with Saudi Arabia and maybe even with Iran.
Mm. Well, on that intriguing note, we better end it. But it's always fascinating talking to you, John. And thanks very much for coming onto the show.
You're more than welcome, Freddie. And thanks for having me on the show.